Hi KRB teachers, welcome to week 5 in the Maximinds Mental Healthcare webinar series. Today we are focusing on strong connections and helping you to listen, validate and respond to your students. A reminder of the 8 webinars in the series, and of course today we are looking at strong connections. So getting straight into the introduction, what will we be learning about today? Firstly, what is listening and how to actually actively listen to your students? What is validating and how to validate your students' emotions and feelings? And finally, what is responding and how to thoughtfully respond to your students in distress? Here is an outline of what today will be looking like, as I just mentioned. So getting straight into an overview. I thought I'd start by giving you some data and statistics as to where teenage girls and teenagers generally are going for help when they're needing it. So as you can see here, how teenagers deal with personal or emotional problems. It's split up by the younger years in senior school and then the older ones. So for our girls in years 7 to 9 that are 12 to 14, a third of them deal with problems on their own rather than choosing to speak to someone. Unfortunately though, girls in the later years from 10 to 12 are more likely to deal with it on their own if they do have a personal or emotional problem. So 1 in 2 will speak to someone and the other 1 in 2 won't. What does this look like in terms of when girls have differing levels of distress? And these are particularly related to teenage girls. So as we can see, for overall teenage girls that have a low level of psychological distress when dealing with personal and emotional problems, 1 in 3 of them will likely deal with it on their own. Increasingly, as they have more moderate distress, they will increasingly choose to then deal with it on their own, with 1 in 2 then choosing to deal with it by themselves. And unfortunately, girls that have high or very high level of distress are more likely, in fact, most likely to deal with problems on their own. As you can see here, 60%. So that's double compared to those that have a low level of distress in the first place. So what does this mean overall for you as teachers? That more senior students, so those in year 10, 11 and 12 who have a high level of distress or a very high level of distress, they're the least likely to reach out and speak to someone about their personal or emotional problems. So we have looked last week at some warning signs that you can start to look out for, given that they're not talking about it necessarily. But what we're going to do today is then look at, well, how can you help to draw out those conversations and what to do? So where are they going if they're not reaching out to people? According to a webinar that was actually hosted by KRB a few years ago from Elephant Ed, when we're looking at sexual consent, they said that the young people's sources of information are most likely going to the internet. Then they're going to their friends. Then, most importantly for you, is they're going to the school, above and beyond even going to their own parents. So you as a school have a huge role here after taking into consideration their Googling and going onto the internet or looking at things online or social media and then going to their friends. You're the third most common way that they will get information. And by extension, my theory is that they're going for the information and then also engaging with it, so hopefully reaching out. So how do they actually reach out to you as a school? And how do they get their support? Particularly relating to those with a mental disorder, half of those with mental disorder in school aged, seek informal support from a school staff member, whether that be a teacher or generally they get it from the school. So that may be special considerations that you give them as teachers, individually within classes, for exams, or overall different dispensations they may have. This is compared to only 14% without a mental disorder that get that informal support. So overall, that's promising in the sense that half of those with mental disorder are getting some informal support, but also what about that other half that aren't necessarily getting school support? how do you ultimately then connect with teens? And that's why we're here today, is to help you draw out, given that we've seen children and girls are particularly not reaching out for support, and they're not necessarily making use of the informal support that's offered for other peers that may be getting that support through the school. So today we're going to look at, as mentioned, listening, validating, and responding. And this is really ultimately how you can communicate with them. We will go into each of these individually, and I want to just close this section by going over why is this important. Obviously, what we've just explored is that we want to be able to have safe environments for our girls to speak to us if they've got extra problems and troubles going on, particularly because the statistics say that they're going to speak to the school and you potentially earlier than even their own parents. So beyond that, why is it important? It helps build trust and emotional connection between you and the girls, encourages the collaboration and problem solving, as we looked at last week, when we draw upon their strengths and empower them to use those, which can also be in the case of dealing with mental illness challenges. It helps for giving enhanced emotional regulation and resilience for the girls. It also helps fosters open communication between you and your students. It increases stronger interpersonal skills and empathy, something that you get to personally take away. Supports their emotional well-being, and ultimately gives you a greater emotional intelligence and understanding of others. So starting with listening, what is listening and how is it defined? Well, the difference between listening and speaking has gone back years to even the ancient Greek times, and philosopher Epictetus said we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. More recently, so even 50 years ago, Carl Rogers, a psychologist who has had a huge impact on the field, said, "I hear the words, the thoughts, the feeling tones, the personal meaning, even the meaning that is below the conscious intent of the speaker." So that's what is active listening. Even today, so 50 years later, as you can see, the definition doesn't change much. A communication skill that involves going beyond simply hearing the words that another person speaks, but also seeking to understand the meaning and intent behind them. It requires being an active participant in the communication process. This is an excellent book that was written by a journalist. In fact, she's contributed to New York Times and other publications, but I really like her because she brings the science and the evidence into what she writes about. And this particular book, You're Not Listening, has great content, which I'm going to touch on bits and bobs throughout today. But one way that she defines listening, or the key components, is that it's about giving descriptive and evaluative information. It's not just being passive in the conversation, as we just saw in the previous definition. Listening is also about responding in a thoughtful, feeling way. And it's also about understanding the intent and meaning beneath the words. And that seems to come out quite repeatedly about this whole meaning that's underlying. As we've looked at in previous weeks, ultimately, we can only observe what children and students do and say, and also ultimately try and infer what they're thinking and feeling. That's not necessarily your job as teachers, obviously, but at least in the first instance, what we will try and do is help you to develop some of these skills to do that. I think the real skill of active listening is that, as we've said, you try to understand them even when, and probably especially when, they're not making sense. If they're going through distressing times and moments, it's probably likely they're actually not making sense. And that's okay as long as you can still try and understand them and empathize with them. You grasp their point of view, even when it's against your own perspective. And I think that's another important thing to note, is that then there won't necessarily be a clear, logical thought pattern, particularly if they're sharing something that is distressing to them. And they may have some of those more irrational perspectives on things, but that's, again, okay. It's more about trying to learn their point of view and how their world views come to be. And the final key skill, I think, is about you give them the ability to make their own decisions, even if it's not necessarily what you think is right. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the topic, the third topic around responding and how we can navigate that even if you don't think it's right. Obviously, there's caveats on that. If there is going to be cause harm to themselves, then we can look at how to intervene. But overall, it is about helping them to empower themselves to make decisions without intervening. So that's all good in theory, but how do we actually listen? How do you actively listen? Well, quite obviously, listening first requires someone talking. In this case, we're wanting to listen to our students and what they're saying. Where do we start? Start by focusing on their strengths, interests, and values. This is not necessarily an obvious place to start, given we're talking about mental illness and well-being, but always starting from a positive psychology frame of mind, I think is advantageous. I do this at the start of every single initial psychology session with any new client, and exploring really who are they initially, so that, as we've looked at before, you can then spot firstly changes, but really getting to know them and being human to them, and initially getting that respect from them. It helps to build that. It makes you more approachable and relatable, and also more of an equal. So ultimately, they want to be comfortable. And a key thing we talk about, obviously, is the psychologist, is this rapport building. And how does that happen? Well, it starts by connecting with them and understanding who they are and what are therefore their strengths, interests, and values. So we covered that last week in particular. In addition to that, some things to listen for. So you're listening for really subtle verbal hints. So these could be comments that they make about feeling overwhelmed all the time, or being tired, or saying things like, I can't do this anymore. I'm just too tired, I'm over this. So they might be more subtle, and it's more if it's a repeated thing that's happening, as we've looked at previously in DSM definitions, over a series of weeks. That's probably the minimum you want to start noticing these sort of verbal hints. You also want to be listening for direct conversations. So they may disclose, for instance, I'm really sad all the time, I need help, can you help me, what do I do? I do find that that's more unlikely. However, if you do have a strong relationship with certain students, they may be more likely to come forward to you to disclose those things. It might even be being direct with you about what's happening at home. There's the divorce of, their parents is really affecting them, or they're moving and they can't study at home. That's really having an impact on their studies, and what's the impact for them. This digital communication is also something that I, as a psychologist, again, think is so powerful to use with children. To give you an example, I work with children all the way from 4 years old to well into their 20s. The younger children increasingly want to type to me messages or text me rather than necessarily have a face-to-face conversation. As they get older, some of them don't even want to put the camera on, for instance, and you might find this, of course, with your students in class, but they might want to turn the camera off, or even have a phone call as a consultation. And then as they get older again into their 20s, then they're happy to put the camera on and that sort of thing. But this new trend of texting and typing how they feel and telling me their secrets, inverted commas, via text, or even on a Zoom that's got no camera or no audio, that is still one way to engage children. And I do think increasingly this is going to be a really effective tool. So it might be via emails, for instance, with your students, or any other chat things that you may use. That's something to obviously look out for. And then finally, indirect signals. So this may be in the context of whether you're learning about something in class that's maybe relevant to them, that they may comment more on, or have more of a stronger opinion on, for instance, or they may be wanting to share more on that topic than their peers, or what they may have wanted to share previously. You may also listen for recurring themes and just trust in your gut that, oh, they've mentioned that a few times and they've got now this fixation, for instance, on divorce or something like that. And how can you listen to that and just really tune into those more indirect signals that you, again, are in such a powerful position of being able to hear them and see them regularly to maybe pick up those patterns. So these are all great things if they're talking. And of course, we know teenagers don't necessarily talk. I feel like girls maybe are more communicative than boys, but that's not to say that girls are vocalizing how they're feeling, as we saw before, particularly those more senior girls that have a high level or a very high level of distress are not necessarily reaching out for someone. They're trying to deal with it themselves. So what does happen if there's no talking? And as you can see here, this is probably more textbook of what's happening with children on the whole, particularly for those older girls. They're having a lot of thoughts and feelings that are going around in their heads while they're sitting probably in your classrooms, and they're not necessarily sharing that. So then what do we do? How do we listen then? The listening, I guess, extends to visually looking at them and observing and being hyper observant. And we looked at this for the last couple of weeks even. So it's really attending to them, being aware of who they are as individuals, what changes you notice, their strengths and interests and values, what suddenly has changed, but also picking up those subtle cues, some of which we've just explored, whether they be verbal or non-verbal. So really attending to the how and the non-verbal cues, far more telling than the what anyway. So given they won't necessarily be talking about it, that's why the role of having eyes on them is going to be more advantageous probably in trying to listen to what's happening, regardless of whether they're actually vocalizing that. As mentioned, I mentioned rapport as a principle of a psychologist and what we do. The other two that I wanted to bring your attention to is empathy and non-judgment. So empathy is really about understanding the perspective of the student without necessarily feeling it yourself, but really understanding what are their thoughts and emotions going on. Non-judgment is really key, as we saw just before. It's not necessarily about having a perspective of your own to inflict upon them. It's more about understanding their worldview as it is, and really here adopting that growth mindset of where you can learn from their worldview and understanding and their perspective. And then finally, of course, rapport and building that warmth in an environment, and building, as you'll know in yourselves, you have those particularly strong relationships, I'm sure, with certain students, and how can you help build those for all students. So really starting by creating the safe environment. They're not going to talk if they don't feel safe, and that psychological safety is all part of the warmth and the rapport. So making them know that they can say anything, that they will not be judged, and you will not judge them. They will not get in trouble for their feelings or emotions, and you will not get angry at them for those. Encourage stories. So, for instance, can you tell me about a time when can you tell me how something made you feel in a certain time? So asking for really specific what's happened, and using that almost as a conversation starter to help them to unpack what they're really experiencing, and can help be almost like a starting probe. So the storytelling, asking why, even when you think you know the answer. This is something we use as part of a broader, more concept of human-centered design. So really, again, putting human at the center. So it's not necessarily in a way that's attacking, but why. It's more to help them actually more self-reflect. Okay, why is that happening? Or, why do you think your homework's, for instance, you're forgetting your homework? Okay, well, because I leave it at home. Okay, and why do you think that happens? Okay, I just forget. I forget to put in my school bag. Okay, and why does that happen? And as you can see, I'm sort of getting to, well, then maybe in that case there could be something that's related to, for instance, ADHD. So you can help them even just by asking why. You can start unpacking for them to help self-reflect. This is not for you to problem solve yourself. That's when you can go off and refer to the school counsellors or a psychologist, but that can help be a conversation to a way to promote conversation in them. Again, we've mentioned this, but the avoiding judgment, not correcting or imposing your opinion. We're just interested in their perspective. That's the most important thing. It is their perspective, and we cover invalidation and how you help validate them is that it's okay for them to feel what they're feeling, and that's part of just them feeling comfortable. And lastly, being fluid. It shouldn't, in most circumstances, except when there may be an added danger or you suspect that they're in harm, it should be quite conversational and not scripted. These are informal conversations, which is more just to help you pick up on, where they're at, what are they experiencing, what's happening in their worlds, and follow what they want to share ultimately. So what they're going to talk about will be quite telling as well as to where they're fixated on, for instance, or where they're spending a lot of time thinking and concerned and consumed by. Respect silence. Unlike what I've just done for the last 20 minutes, silence is key in being a psychologist. And there's two quotes here, or mottos that Japan has. The silent man is the best to listen to, versus in America, it's the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I think that's interesting. This is a quote that's also come from the book that I mentioned before, You're Not Listening, and that Japanese businessmen tolerate an average of 8.2 seconds versus American business people. Sorry, I hope I said business people before as well. Business people tolerate an average silence of 4.6 seconds. So that's just something to be, I think, be mindful of, particularly when we're talking about children's feelings, and that they will take longer sometimes, and it's okay to have that extra silence in between while they're trying to process and think about what to say. Another important thing for you to think about, I think, as teachers, is consider those informal moments. It's not necessarily when you're sitting across the table from them that they're going to divulge everything and anything about how they're feeling, what's happening at home, and all this sort of thing. It's more about the informal moments. If you can help pick up and just be, again, hyper observant too. So for instance, in the class, in like a school or a school sports activity or carnival even, that all the teachers would attend, if you're a PE teacher, for instance, even if they're playing at recess or lunch, can you notice sort of subtle cues that you're picking up that you can repeatedly see that they may be feeling left out or lonely or just not wanting to get involved? Same sort of thing as in the playground. If you can see that they're not behaving necessarily quite like themselves, can you pick up those sorts of cues? You can also approach this in terms of more walking between classes. So how can you have casual conversations then? That's probably most likely when they're not looking straight across from you, that they will share. And for parents, an equivalent is driving in the car is an excellent time, because they're not having to be eyeballed from their parents right across the dinner table, for instance. So it's those really informal moments that I think you also seem to get a lot more from students. And lastly, a bit of neuropsychology for you. Put your best ear forward. So put very simplistically, our right ear obviously connects to our left brain, and that's where comprehension sits, particularly a place called Wernicke's area. That's where the language comprehension sits. That is good to use your right ear when listening for an understanding the rational perspective from potentially a student as how they're feeling, how they're interpreting the world. The theory then is on the left ear, that connects to the right brain, which is where a more emotional processing sits. So when you're trying to really understand the emotion, that's a a light theory as to putting your left ear forward to listen to that. It's not necessarily foolproof, but there is definitely a difference in the time that it takes to connect from the left to the right. And you might just notice subtly that you tend to listen with a left or a right ear, which is more of an interesting thing for you all to think about. And so moving on to what is validating. Well, validation is defined as the recognition or affirmation that a person or their feelings or opinions are valid or worthwhile. So a few things to draw your attention to is that this is about recognizing and affirming your students' feelings and emotions, and also giving them the recognition and affirmation that these are credible, worthwhile, valid, they're legitimate. To also go back to ancient definitions, medieval Latin defines validation as the act of giving validity. And I've underlined here giving validity because it's not necessarily about deciding whether something's legitimate or credible or not. It's more about giving that validity. So to summarize that, deciding validity and whether you think it's valid, legitimate, warranted in that situation in terms of a student's feelings or emotions is very different to actually giving the validity to them. What that means is that it's not necessarily about saying whether you think it's right or accurate, but more so giving them the acknowledgement and affirmation that what they're feeling and they're going through and their emotions, their experience are legitimate to them at that time. So the skill, like we looked at, of active listening, similarly, the skill of giving validity is that you acknowledge their feelings and emotions, even when they're not necessarily rational. And we'll look at how this differs in terms of their actions in responding and how you can help navigate that. But at least for now, their emotions and feelings are acknowledged. Secondly, giving validity is that you recognize their feelings and emotions, even then when that's not necessarily how you might feel in those circumstances. It's very tricky to truly empathize with someone when you haven't fully walked in their shoes and know all of the complexities and the ins and outs of their lives and their circumstances that would be why these feelings and emotions are being experienced at that time. And finally, giving validity is that you affirm their feelings and emotions, even when they're not necessarily a typical reaction. And this is about, again, recognizing that they're valid for them, even if that's not necessarily what you would experience or see from another of their students or peers. We will again look at this in terms of the responding and how to deal with it, because that could be indicative or a potential for a mental illness that would need to be addressed, because it's not typical or what you would expect. But at this stage, it's still just about giving that validity to help the student. And the benefits for the students by giving that validity are many and varied. Some of these benefits for them include that it promotes their mental health and well-being by just acknowledging that they're feeling that way and that's okay is going to help them to feel more of a sense of control and a sense of calm over what they're feeling. It fosters self-compassion and self-acceptance in the student, so they know that whatever they're feeling is okay and it's warranted. It's not necessarily something that means they're evil or bad. It encourages authentic, honest expression for them going forwards. They're more likely to open up to you going forward. And it encourages collaboration and problem solving, both for themselves individually, but also, as we've explored, from a benefit for you as a teacher to help them, guide them through different challenges. It also facilitates in them personal growth and self-awareness, because they're able to recognise and be replayed back what they're feeling and what their emotions are. It empowers them and also enhances their general health and emotional expression. So how do you specifically validate students and their feelings and emotions? Well, you can do this by many ways, but three important ways are being reflective, empathetic, and affirming. Firstly, in terms of being reflective, this is about repeating or rephrasing your students' feelings to show that you understand and acknowledge their emotions. So for instance, if they say, I'm frustrated because I can't figure out this maths problem, this may seem quite obvious, but it's saying something like, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated by maths. Note that they haven't said, I don't want to do maths, I give up on this, I don't like maths, this is not good. It's literally just replaying back to them and paraphrasing the exact word that they used in the context of talking about this maths problem. So just almost parroting what they're saying, and we call that paraphrasing. Again, it's another tool that we use as psychologists to help them hear the same words that they've just used back to them. It helps with that self-awareness and their own self-development. Another technique is to be empathetic. So we show empathy by recognizing and sharing in your students' emotions. And this can be done through words, tone of voice, and body language, just as all of these can. But for instance, in this case, empathy often is done really well when you're mimicking and responding to their expressions and particularly those non-verbal cues that we looked at earlier. So for instance, you may see them upset if they're in the playground, for instance, or you just see that they're in the classroom and they're not necessarily ever included in group work, and they may be thinking, and this is where you can almost infer that they're always feeling left out of groups. This is when you can say something like, I can understand how being left out would make you feel sad. Here, if they're crying, then sad would be a natural inference to make based on their feelings and emotions. You could also say things like, I can see you're upset. Do you want to talk to me about that? So you can also use and replay back their bodily gestures and what they're doing from their facial expressions and how they're expressing those to replay back to them to help open up that dialogue and conversation. Another part of giving validity and validating your students' feelings and emotions is doing something called affirming. So affirm their feelings and offer support to your students by letting them know that their emotions are normal. So in this case, they may say something like, I'm worried about the English exam coming up. Again, they may not say it as explicitly as this, but you could tell them they're mounting. They're wanting more and more feedback. They want you to keep marking their essays, for instance, and you can just tell they're worried. The simple thing of saying to them, it's very normal to feel anxious before a test. A lot of students do. This is really normal, particularly in the lead up to, your first year 7, even yearly exams. Just as stressful or worrying to a student as it may be to the final HSC exam. So just giving that validation so that they know that's normal, this is expected, and giving them the affirmation that what they're feeling going through is fine. On the flip side, as we've mentioned a couple of times, what happens if you're thinking if their feelings are valid, and I'll acknowledge now that all feelings are valid, but objectively not necessarily healthy and or beneficial for them. And then what do you do? And this is where we get into what is responding. Now, most importantly, it's important to note that regardless of whether you believe your students' feelings and emotions are beneficial or healthy to them, it's always important to start with validating their feelings and emotions. So that's important so that they already know that you've heard them and that they have been affirmed in how they're feeling, because of course we can't argue with people's feelings and emotions. So always starting with validation. Then what does responding really mean? And again, to return to now the 14th century, some Latin, means to promise in return, reply, and answer. And that in return is important because it's about responding to something as a return. Re is also obviously back to the original place. And what is that original place? We'll look at on the next slide. And sponder, to pledge. So it's going back to something and pledging something in return. So what is the back to the original place? Ultimately, it's going back to your active listening skills and really using them to help identify, well, what are they coming to you for in the first place? So start by identifying their needs. So are they asking you a question? For instance, this may sound like, well, what should I do here? They may be coming to you to share. This may sound something along the lines of, I just wanted to tell you something. They also may be coming to you as more of a cry for help. And this could sound like something like, I really need help, or I don't know what to do. So going back to active listening and returning to what actually they're asking for from you in the first place is really important. So then what are the types of responding that you can engage in? You can, of course, say a verbal response, and that could be offering validation, which I would always encourage in the first instance, asking for more questions and further clarification to really understand. That could be also in the form of gestures, so more of the non-verbal response here, showing your concern on your face and your facial expressions. It could be nodding. It could be also acknowledging and smiling and giving reassurance. That way, it could be even giving thumbs up if you are returning to, for instance, even positive emotions or feelings. And another type of responding is, of course, you could do something. And this is typically a response that would be post, perhaps a conversation. So what are you going to action afterwards? For instance, it might be whether you go off and speak to the parents, other teachers and counsellors after discussing their concerns with them. It's important to know, of course, that students sometimes just want to vent. They will not always necessarily come to you with a problem that you need to fix. And in fact, we would encourage you to help them to self-manage in the first instance at least. Appreciating that particularly you as teachers are already so busy and you've already got so many different roles, that taking on the role as a psychologist or a counsellor on top of that is a lot, and frankly not possible. So acknowledging that sometimes they may just want to get something off their chest, and that's important as well. And yes, you can still give them a response that would be suitable in that case, but it's good just to acknowledge in the first place that they're comfortable enough to share something with you and their concerns, which is really good, and that's courageous in the first instance. And of course, when we're dealing with feelings and emotions and challenging ones, the first instance of talking about it is really important. So that's just something to keep in mind. So how do you actually respond? As mentioned before, there's a book that I think is excellent called You're Not Listening, and I just want you to read an inspired excerpt from that book. A few things I want to call out here. In this instance, for instance, if a student's saying, I hate something, for instance, I hate polynomials, I just can't do it and I'm not sitting an exam, they're not going to sit their maths exam. These are three typical responses that can happen. So the grilling, which is interrogating. So for instance, saying, well, what is it that you hate about polynomials, and why do you think you can't do it? That more of attack. Another response typically might be that telling them they shouldn't feel that way. So telling them, well, you shouldn't hate polynomials because it's really important to know as part of maths. That's minimizing and undermining what they're feeling in that moment. And finally, changing the subject is just maddening. So for instance, saying, well, don't worry about the polynomials so much. Why don't you just sit the rest of the exam and ignore that? And of course, that will create more fury and anger potentially in your student. As you can see here, alternatives are things like, have you always felt this way? Or what would not sitting the exam mean for you? This is what I was mentioning before, is that sometimes they may just want to vent. And in this case, this could just be a vent. Are they really going to not then sit the exam because they don't like one topic? Possibly, possibly not. Also, going back to that importance of helping them to self-manage themselves and think about well, what are the outcomes of their decisions and actions? So, for instance, here, well, okay, well, I've heard you. What would then sitting an exam look like for you? And what would that mean? What's the impact there? So, in the first instance, it's helping them to reflect on what they're feeling and why, and then what they're deciding to do or not do. So that self-management's excellent. It's very good to help you and you to deal with the issue in the interim, but also to help encourage and empower them and give them that greater sense of control, which, as we've looked at previously, is great for promoting mental health and well-being. And that final statement there about looking at it as an invitation to have a conversation. And another reminder, it's not about something necessarily you have to fix. And in fact, quite the opposite. I think it's always good to help students, particularly high school students who are capable of doing so, is try and problem solve and think about how to respond and manage these emotions themselves in the first instance. We go back to, again, what happens though if their feelings are valid, but objectively not healthy and or beneficial for them. As we said, always starting with the validation and then what, and how do you go from there? So then you can start probing, and it's not to necessarily, again, problem solve for them, it's to help them self-reflect. So for instance, if they again said that they hate the polynomial topic and they don't want to do it, things you could say would be, firstly, to validate. For instance, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated by X polynomials, for instance. So always start with that validation. Then you can say something along the lines of, what would not sitting an exam mean for you? So the most important message here is, when responding, regardless of whether the emotions and feelings are beneficial or not, validate feelings and then help lead them to think about the consequences of their behaviours that are associated with those feelings and emotions. So further strategies for responding. So offering support, remind them that you're always there to keep talking about it, and it doesn't just have to be a one conversation and that's it. And in fact, quite the opposite. I would still suggest, regardless of what someone's saying, a student's coming to you with, in the first instance, it would be common sense to then follow up at least one other time. Ask open-ended questions, so sparking curiosity and critical thinking to then put it onto them to help problem solve. Collaborate with them. As we looked at, in some instances, they will be coming potentially to share something, but they also may want you to help with them with that problem solving and overcoming their challenge. Providing guidance. Resources are a great tool that you can use to obviously help them to self-manage, to direct them. Things like, for instance, do you want to consider going to the counsellor, for instance, or do you want to look at different online tools that, things like Maximinds that they can help be directed to. And avoid judgment, so not correcting or imposing your own opinion. We're interested in their perspective, and that goes back to the critical features of active listening as well, and being a psychologist is definitely avoid judgment as much as possible and come from a place of curiosity rather than being critical towards them. Now, there may be instances when you're unsure how to respond, and I'm sure there have already been instances in your own experience as teachers, and there definitely will be at some stage. So if you're not sure how to respond, start by at least thanking them for sharing. That's that encouragement that they'll need so that they know you've heard them. And also to give them that confidence that, thanks for coming to me and feeling comfortable to do so, to just encourage them in that bravery. After you've had some sort of conversation with them, follow up with, even in that conversation, how are you feeling now? That helps them to, in the moment, also that self-reflect, which is great for them to be feeling self-empowered again. Then what do you think you can do from here? So really, as you can see, we're really encouraging self-management as much as possible. If in the instance that they're coming to you for more of that cry for help or SOS, that's maybe when you say something like, I can see you need help here. How do you think I can best help you? And finally, if you really don't have a response or an idea as to exactly how to help in that moment, and you are concerned and you do want to go and consult, for instance, the counsellor or their parents or someone else that would be suitable, say something like, do you mind if I think about the best way to go from here and come back to you? That last one in particular, when we're trained as psychologists, one of the early features I remember being taught was, don't make someone else's emergency your own urgency. So you can put some time in between responding immediately straight to someone, particularly when they've got those feelings and emotions, which can be quite hyped up. And it's just about taking a breath, and you're able to do that yourself as teachers, to put a bit of space in between this student who may be quite emotional and how you want to choose to respond. So they will also be grateful, most likely, for the follow-up and the knowledge that you're going away and actually coming back to them with a considered response. So all of these sorts of things are okay to do. Now, to give you a scenario, I just want you to think about, if a student's come to you and said this, how would you respond? So my mum's passed away and I feel so sad all the time and I find it hard to keep myself from crying. If you can just think about what you would do. So, suggested actions. What we would suggest is, firstly, validating their feelings and thanking them for opening up to you. Hopefully that's clear by now. The validation is really important to start with. In this instance, we've put that first because they've already disclosed specifically how they feel. They've already said, I'm feeling so sad and feel like crying. That may be a particularly self-aware child who knows exactly already what their emotions are and communicating to them. So sometimes, if that's the case, it's always about validating first. Then listen without judgment and show that you're giving them that care by giving them the time and attention. Then finally, identify if the issue can be self-managed or it requires that outside help, and proceed accordingly. So sorts of things you could say in each of these three instances might be: start by validating, I'm sorry to hear you're feeling so sad. You must be going through a very hard time. Thank you for telling me. Other things you could say are, I'm here for you. Understandably, you must feel like crying. So just acknowledging, particularly using their words, the crying here or the sad before, and also looking for that meaning beneath the surface, which is we looked at in active listening, and actually extrapolating that they're clearly going through a very hard time. So that sort of extra wording and rapport around it is very helpful, so that they really feel like you've heard them. Unhelpful statements. I know how you feel. You may very well, but in this moment, it's about them and validating their emotions and feelings. Try and focus on your schoolwork, as we looked at before. Minimizing and helping them to change the subject to distract them or make them focus on something else, unfortunately, is not the best avenue. And we know that the more you try and suppress thoughts and feelings and try and distract yourself, unfortunately, the bigger and louder those feelings and emotions come. Secondly, listening. So how do you show that you're listening? Saying things like, I'm here for you. Would you like to talk about it now or after class with me? So even giving them in that moment an option that's self-empowering to them, and asking what they would like to do about it. Other phrases could be, I can't imagine what you're going through right now. This must be really impacting you. Again, inferring that it's obviously impacting them is something that would be appropriate, given that would be the underlying implied meaning beneath of what's happening. This is probably why they're coming to you. They've already got this personal tragedy going on at home, and it's now they've brought it to school to come and speak to you about. You could infer that it is impacting both their home and school life. Unhelpful statements. I lost my mum around your age too. Not necessarily always not a helpful statement in the case of sharing experiences and emotions, can be sometimes comforting. It's just in that first initial conversation, ensuring, again, it's about them and listening to what they're having to say. Do you want to go to the school counsellor? they haven't necessarily mentioned anything about what they want you to do for them, and giving them options to shift straight away is not necessarily the listening itself. You're not there necessarily to problem solve and fix them, as we've talked about. So that may be a good response at some stage, but whether that's the initial first thing that happens. And finally, act. So saying something like, what can I do to help support you with your schoolwork or otherwise? So acknowledging there's definitely an impact personally, but also at school, and how could you even be mindful of, well, how could you help across both those two domains for them? You'll also see, what can I do to help you, support you? So helping them to think about, well, what is it that they're wanting or knowing, what they're wanting or asking. And if they're not sure at this stage, then you can obviously come up with suitable suggestions. But at this stage, definitely firstly ask them what they want. Other phrases, how can I help? And where would you like to go to from here? So implying that, how can we help problem solve this together if that's something that you're wanting to do? The inferred meaning of them coming to you and choosing you to speak to is, of course, indicative enough of that they're wanting some sort of assistance with this. Unhelpful statements. I suggest you tell all your teachers. They've come to you specifically for a reason, so honour and respect that. And if that is something they'd like to do, then sure, that could be a suggestion at some stage, but for right now, they've come to you. And same thing with, I'll book you in with the counsellor. You're not there to fix or manage. You can help guide them. That is caveated with, of course, the possibility that you do believe they need to speak to someone. But just in that initial moment, really just hearing them, helping them, they've come to you for a reason. And so respecting that, and at least that confidentiality and privacy for that first instance. Of course, when to report to the school counsellor. If you believe they're highly distressed, and if they're having troubles, things like concentrating, or you can see they're constantly crying and they can't stop that crying that they mention. Duration of 2 weeks. As we've already seen, the minimum for diagnosing any sort of mental illness disorder is typically at least 2 weeks. So if this is going on for longer than that, then definitely raise that to the counsellors. Disruption to the class environment. If they're impacting not only their own learning environment, but your entire class, then of course you really need to step in somehow. And most importantly, if you hear of or see any instances of suicidal ideation or self-harming, then, and they're in danger, then escalating is of course essential. Beyond this, I'm sure you've already got your own duty of care, and we will look further at what the specific steps would be to go and get extra support and help, and how to escalate, and knowing when to, in that final webinar in week 8 as well. And finally, to summarise what we have learnt, hopefully today, I again will show you a summary, and if you wouldn't mind then answering the one question just to check whether your understanding has developed afterwards, that would be much appreciated. So what do we learn today? Listening involves understanding the meaning of what a student is saying behind the actual words they're saying. Listen by attending to both verbal and non-verbal cues, being hyper-observant, demonstrating empathy, non-judgment and rapport, but also creating a safe, psychologically safe environment, respecting silence and considering those informal moments in between just the classroom. Validating is recognising and affirming a student's feelings and giving them validity, even when they're not necessarily rational or typical reactions that you yourself would have. Validation involves being reflective, which is about paraphrasing back to them what they're saying and using the words that they use. Empathetic, recognising and sharing emotions. And affirming, so normalising their feelings and supporting them. Finally, responding is returning, replying or answering a student's specific needs, which goes back to why the active listening is so important in the first place. And responding involves validating, listening and taking action while attending to obviously your duty of care as a teacher. As mentioned, if you could please scan the QR code and complete one question to indicate how you have developed in your understanding, hopefully today, but also any feedback you have as to things you still need clarification on or not sure of. That would be great. Finally, resources to attend to emergency contacts. In addition to these is, of course, the school counsellor, as we've looked at today. There is also the option for you to go on to Maximinds as a teacher, subscribe for 3 months for free to access the tools and strategies that you might need for when to respond to certain feelings and emotions. And they are all available for you there. You can access that by scanning this QR code. And of course, there are my contact details. If you have any further questions, would like to reach out to me for further support, please do so. Thank you all and see you next week.